After graduating from the high school he came from, he found himself deeply admiring life in the big city for some reason. It had been 10 years since he left the village. He went to work every morning, shaken up by a train full of passengers. It was a job where perseverance was constantly tested, and he was assigned more and more responsibilities, which made his time in the office even longer. He wondered why he had to endure all of this just for a boss like that. He went home, slammed the door, and felt exhausted. He barely caught the last train, even on weekends that he rarely had, and he had lost interest in reading his favorite historical novel. His daily life was boring, without any changes. He went to bed and thought of his peaceful and beautiful hometown, missing it deeply before closing his eyes. When he woke up, he looked around and felt that something was strange. He looked at his hands and wondered why they were so small. Shocked, he realized his body had shrunk and he peeked out the window. Looking outside, he wondered where he was. Then someone called out, "Vansama!" The maid warned that it was dangerous there. It was Vansama's personal maid until 12. Van said sorry, and the maid freaked out, asking who he was. Van's personal maid remarked that he had always been spoiled before. Van, however, was captivated by the view outside and moved by the beauty of the garden. The maid asked Vansama where he had learned such difficult words and how he could pronounce them so fluently. She found it impossible, especially since he was only 2 years old. Van was shocked to realize he was only 2 years old, even though he would soon be 30. He remembered his life as a corporate office employee living in a small one-room apartment in the city. Confused by his new body and the presence of the maid, he began to wonder if this was what people called reincarnation. Since memories of his previous life still lingered, Van confirmed that the maid's name was Till, his private maid. The maid was surprised and happy to be acknowledged. Van confirmed that his name was Van Nai Fertio. The maid was impressed that Van could even say his last name, thinking he was truly smart. Van correctly recalled that his father was Duke Jalpa Fertio, and that his older brothers were Mercia, Yard, and Sesto. The maid was surprised that he even remembered the names of Yard Sama and Sesto Sama, whom he rarely saw. Meanwhile, in the dining hall sat the head of the Duke family, Jalpa Pul Ati Fertio, 44 years old, and his children were Mercia Elago Fertio, 14 years old, Yardguy Fertio, 10 years old, Sesto Ela Fertio, 8 years old, and the youngest, Van, who was eating vegetables. The maid was impressed that Van ate his vegetables so well. He ate quietly and carefully, spilling almost nothing. The maid admired Van for being so well behaved. Van felt as if he were a VIP in a hostess bar. It seemed he still retained memories from his life in Japan before being reincarnated in this world. Although he didn't fully understand or feel that it was real, he resolved to do his best. Like the sweetness and deliciousness of the carrot he was eating. The father spoke in an irritated tone, causing Yard to appear scared. The father asked what Yard had learned that day. Yard panicked as he answered that he had learned about fire magic and battle formations that day. At dinner, the father asked his 10-year-old what he had done that day, inquiring about his daily activities as part of the family routine. Van wondered if this was a custom among nobles. They kept their distance from their children, did nothing in the mornings, and spent the day teaching sword techniques and education appropriate to the children's age. The father asked Sesto what he was doing, and Sesto proudly said he had been learning magic. Van, who was not usually asked, was surprised when his father also inquired about what he had done that day. Van replied that he didn't know anything at first, so he had thought of studying the history and culture of the country. Everyone was stunned by his answer. The father laughed, thinking that since Van was the youngest son left by his wife Mira, he might have been spoiled. Yet despite being only 2 years old, Van was remarkably smart. There was no doubt in the father's mind that Van must have strong fire magic, just like him and Mira. He looked forward to the coming-of-age ceremony when Van would be 8 years old, at which time his aptitude for magic would be evaluated. The father looked forward to it, anticipating Van's progress. In a world filled with magic, it was important to know what kind of magic one possessed, and whether it suited them. Noble families required their children to master the 4 basic elemental magics: fire, water, air, and earth, which were devoted to both attack and protecting the family and residents, or to healing magic. Those with talent in other types of magic risked suffering humiliation. Van's father and brothers were all compatible with the 4 elemental magics. His eldest brother specialized in wind, while his second and third brothers were proficient in fire magic. Van thought that, in his opinion, any type of magic could still be useful depending on how it was used. The Ferdio family was a noble house, specializing in military power within a large military country. They took particular pride in fire magic, which was strong for offensive purposes. The world was developing at a pace similar to the medieval and early modern periods, but magic made many things easier. While firearms were not widespread, existing weapons consisted of swords, spears, bows, and arrows. Above all, magic remained the most important asset. The world consisted of 3 continents and countless islands. Existing weapons were all conventional, such as swords, spears, bows, and arrows. Van was currently in a large country located in the southern part of the first continent, known as the Scuderia Kingdom. Its royal family had ruled for 300 years, steadily expanding the kingdom's territory. The current king led the nobles who possessed military power, attacking smaller countries to annex new lands. It seemed that even Van's father had been promoted from count to duke because of these campaigns. Van wondered if this was the only port where ships could sail safely. Traveling through the open sea risked attacks by giant monsters, while passing through the strait would be difficult without navigating the narrow location. Van's eyes sparkled as he thought about legendary monsters. It seemed there were also animal-like creatures, making the arrival of Europeans during their age of exploration impossible. The maid explained that, besides humans, there were various other races, such as elves, dwarves, and beastfolk. However, since these races had built their own cultures in the countryside, it was rare to see them. Another maid remarked that Till's words had been very difficult to understand from the beginning. Till then suggested that Von Sama might want to take a nap. Von said it was okay and thanked them, explaining that he asked because he wanted to learn a lot. He then wondered if any of them were tired. The maids were all shocked but replied that they were fine. The old butler thought that Van was a prodigy. He couldn't believe that at only 2 years old, Van was already showing such concern for them as a respectable noble family. It was the first time he had witnessed something like this. The butler, Esparta, acknowledged that Van Sama was only 2 years old and wondered how much he had already learned, such as letters and numbers. Van thought that Esparta had served his father for many years and seemed capable, yet he had never spoken to him until now. Esparta asked how much Van could remember so far. Van thought that Esparta was intimidating, and that this was not the way to speak to a 2-year-old child. Van thought that since he could speak, it was fine for Esparta to ask, though he couldn't write yet. Esparta then inquired about his knowledge of numbers. Van said he only do a little addition and subtraction. He felt very nervous and thought about wanting to run away from there. Esparta asked what the result would be if 2 and 3 were added together. Van, shaking, answered 5. Esparta held up 7 in both hands and asked how much it would be if 2 were subtracted. Van answered 5. Everyone fell silent. Esparta decided that he would personally teach Van Sama twice a week. The moment Esparta's lessons began, Van thought it was truly like hell. This was not something a 2-year-old was meant to learn, and the learning materials were far too much. Esparta thought that Van didn't even move his eyebrows, yet still completed the lessons perfectly. He wondered if the boy was some kind of android. While writing, Van thought about monsters like golems or the undead, feeling excited at the idea. However, after continuously receiving lessons, the experience felt like hell. Van could read and write, and he was learning many things, including war tactics, the noble system, and territorial unification. Van wondered what exactly a 2-year-old was supposed to be doing. Over the past 2 years, he had constantly learned various things. He practiced swordsmanship, thinking that it felt like playing with magic in the tatami room. If it was like this, he would be willing to spend even 50,000 yen. The art of the sword was that much fun. Till, who had been sparring with Van, swung her sword and claimed victory. Van annoyed and chased after Till with his sword. The senior among the maids scolded Till for daring to offend Vansama and suggested that she be given some punishment. Van thought that the punishment seemed like a good idea, till teary-eyed remarked that such a rude act was usually considered a grave offense against noble families. Van poked Till on the forehead and said it was done. Till looked at him uncertainly, but Van confirmed that it was all finished. Till apologized to Vansama. Van thought that Till was a great servant. Even though the training had lasted only half a year, he had been learning sword techniques every day. By the age of 5, he was able to fight on par with the older apprentices, known as the young warriors. Van thought about how, in his world, he had studied judo in middle school and also trained in karate at the dojo, which made him love martial arts. With a fairly simple rule, hitting the opponent first with a stick meant victory, he found himself unexpectedly drawn in, fascinated by it. He focused on maintaining a strong, profitable position before losing balance in judo. He used karate to read the opponent's movement while taking a break so that it can deliver a sharp blow. Van will also use these two in his sword technique. An opponent who is around 10 years old with a tall body and long arms and legs. When he swings the stick, it will reach farther. However, since his opponents are children, the attacks are monotonous. After all, they neither have skills nor experience. No matter how many times they do it, he can understand it, especially with his 30 years of experience. The people around him praised him, recognizing him as a prodigy. They admired Van's skill and acknowledged that he also possessed talent in swordsmanship. They talked about Vansama, saying that unlike Yard-sama and Sesto-sama, he was willing to speak with low-caste people like them. Since those two were both compatible with fire magic, they had no interest in sword arts. Others mentioned that they had also been speaking with Vansama lately, and remarked that he was truly a mysterious person. The deputy chief of the Knights, D, approached Van and respectfully asked him a question. Van thought that D was one of the strongest within the Duke's residence and responded, waiting to hear what he wanted to ask. D said loudly that he wanted to see Van's hand. Van allowed it, and D examined it carefully. Van asked what he was doing. D noticed that Van's nails were long. His skin showed no peeling and his hands were soft. He thought that although Van claimed to practice every night, there was absolutely no evidence of that. Van explained that he was very busy studying, but when he had free time he practiced since he also liked swords. He apologized and added that once he grew up, he would practice anyway. D mentioned that he had heard rumors saying Esparta Dono had issued an order for Van to study 3 times more than usual. Van was shocked, realizing that was why he had so many lessons. Since he was the only one studying from morning to night, he had thought it was strange. D then said that if Van wanted to learn more about swords, he would personally teach him. D thought that the big head was too academically biased. From his perspective, as someone who could judge people fairly, he believed that Vansama should follow the path of the sword. He told Vansama that he had natural talent and suggested that he first remember his posture, train his muscles, and continue daily training suited to his body. D vowed that he would be the one to make Vansama the #1 swordsman in the kingdom. Van thought that D looked really serious, a big-headed muscle maniac. He said that even though he liked the sword, he also enjoyed studying and would do his best to learn both. D replied that there was nothing he could do, but at the very least, every time Van practiced swordsmanship, he would personally train him. Van asked him to teach kindly, and D agreed, saying that since Vansama was still a child, Van began to feel pressured and started to sweat, and all of that had been a complete lie. Meanwhile, during training, D commanded Van to swing upward 100 times, swing at the middle 100 times, and perform 100 stabs. Van, exhausted, pleaded for a break, saying he was still just running. D shouted back that he could rest later and urged him to keep going. Van sat down on the bench and thought to himself that D was a devil. Then D suddenly said he remembered something and told Van that when resting he should stay free, suggesting that he rest by squatting instead. Van thought that D wasn't a devil after all, but an idiot, a fool resting in a floating chair pose. This idiot. The soldiers cheered for Vansama, urging him to fight, while others called out to the deputy leader not to overdo it. Till approached and told Vansama that he had worked hard, and Van thanked her. Till praised him, saying he was amazing for training every day. Van thought that even though everything was difficult, every day was truly enjoyable. The sense of satisfaction he had never felt in his previous life now filled him in this one. Being reborn into one of the greatest noble families, he decided to enjoy this pleasant life. Years later, it had been a few years since he was called a prodigy. His father declared that Van did not understand the humiliation of failure, and that rather than remain in the Marquis family, it would be better if he were killed. His father then raised his sword, preparing to end Van's life once more.